Dr. Anderson, people get extremely confused about socialism.
Oh,
So
yeah.
I was hoping that you could help out answer some of the questions that I've heard and that we have, and tell us a bit more about socialism. What does socialism mean, and why is it so easily confusing for people?
Oh, well, there's so many different meanings to socialism that it's really hard to pinpoint what kind of socialism someone is talking about. So I think we first have to go to communism. And communism was the philosophy, if you will, or the political system that economic and political system that Karl Marx came up with in Das Kapital. And his idea of heaven on earth is a world where everyone had enough of everything and they could really explore themselves. And it would be each according to his need. So if a person needed some fish for dinner, I'd give him some fish. And if someone needed new shoes, give him the new shoes. And if someone wanted to discuss philosophy, they could just discuss philosophy. But before you could get to communism, you had to go through another stage called socialism. And socialism, it would be each according to his deed. And so what that means is that people would be compensated for whatever they produced. And so if someone produced fish, that would be worth so much. If someone produced philosophy, well, is that hot air? Maybe that's worth a lot less than, a pair of shoes or some fish when you're hungry. And so that got a little bit difficult. But people associate socialism with the stage before communism. And communism is state dictated equality. And it turned into totalitarian governments. And people don't like those. The United States set itself as the leader of the free world against communism. So when they hear socialism, like the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, that's what they often think about. But for Europeans, that's not what they think about. Most democracies in the world have two main parties. And one party is a conservative party, and the other party is a center-left party or a socialist party. And they're not talking about communism in any way. They're talking about coming up with thinking about teamwork and looking for community solutions to problems. And that's all they mean by it. They don't mean government dictated equality. And so when people talk about socialism in that way, they're really talking about a bunch of mainstream ideas that are center left, that are based on doing things that are for the betterment of society as a whole.
With those things being said, though, the United States tried to fight against all of that, right? So is there any socialism here? Do we see it in the US? Do we see it in Wyoming?
Well, a lot of people don't know. In terms of communism, there were actually a lot of communist towns, especially in places like Indiana and Illinois. And the idea was that you'd have a bunch of people in a town, and they would all cooperate and share and work together. And it was they wouldn't need any government. They kind of live off on their own. So we actually have some examples of that. In Wyoming, it's a very progressive constitution in Wyoming. And it says that there should be free public education and that the University of Wyoming should be as free as possible. So really interesting that way that the government should support education so much that people should get as nearly free as possible a college education. That's part of the reason why the University of Wyoming is such a great bargain that way. The state legislature does a lot for us.
Is that all we see? Is it free college? Is that the call for socialism now? Or how are we really looking at socialism when we hear it being used by senators or people in the House of Representatives?
You have to be careful. Part of the reason why socialism is such a difficult nut to crack is because the word itself is politicized. You hear it and people say, oh, it means communism. They say it means Bernie Sanders. It means, AOC, it means all these things. But if we look at it like from just regular case studies, let me give you a few examples. You'll see that it's really not such a big deal in a way. Let me give you an example. I have some relatives who are cattle ranchers, and for years they paid in the summer to spray for mosquitoes. And they had a lot of land, and so it cost them quite a bit of money because you got to kill those mosquitoes. And the people who lived in the town, Well, they had a great summer, right? Because they didn't have any mosquitoes biting them. But after years and years, the ranchers said they were tired of footing the bill for all the townsfolk, so they could have a nice mosquito-free summer. So the ranchers got together and they went to their local government and they raised taxes, and they made a tax so that everyone would pay for mosquito control equally. Now, is that socialism? Well, yeah, it is. First of all, it's raising taxes. It's giving a public good, something that everyone can benefit from. And it's spreading out the cost equally in this tax. So it doesn't fall too hard on one group as opposed to another. And that's an example. But a lot of people, they don't like it because local government got in the way. They had to get involved. Raise taxes. What? People normally don't like that. But are you better off that way? And that's a question. Let me give you another example. There was a man who bought a ticket on an airplane, and he paid for it. Maybe this has happened to you or someone watching, and you get called and you say, sorry, we sold too many seats, right? You have to get bumped. Is that fair? Right? If someone sells you something, right? Aren't you supposed to say, yeah, I paid for it. You can't take this away from me. And this guy said, no, I'm not going to leave my seat. I paid for it. It's your fault for overbooking. It's not my fault. And they said, no, that's too bad. Don't worry, we'll give you miles. And he said, I don't want miles. I want to go home. And they actually took air marshals and dragged him off the airplane, and he broke his nose. Who got involved with this? Congress, because it's a federal issue, because anytime you're crossing state lines, it's a federal issue. And they changed the laws and the federal regulations. And they said airlines can no longer just kick someone off and give them miles. They have to offer them a cash award for what they were doing. So effectively, they get a refund and maybe a little bit extra for being bumped off the flight. So is this a good thing? Well, the government got involved. They regulated business. So the business wasn't free to continue doing what it was doing. The business will probably make less money because of it. But then in the end, people are, I would say, consumers are better off. You have a little bit more guarantee. So always these pros and cons. How much do you want the government to get involved? A lot of people, they say they hate government, but then if there's a problem, they go, why doesn't the government do something about it? And so there's kind of a love-hate relationship, right? They like it when the government does things they like, and they don't like it when the government does things that they don't like.
I mean, I'm hearing overlap between socialism and capitalism, or at least this ideal of capitalism, and also socialism and government. So I feel like I've heard both used. Is socialism an economic system? Is it a government system? Is it magically both? Is it neither? Where do we sort socialism?
Socialism is a political system, it's an economic system, and it's also philosophy. And so, another reason why it gets so confusing as to what it is, I suppose the philosophy maybe makes the most sense. How much should government get involved in the economy? How much should government get involved with business? That's really where the friction lies. How much should it? And if you are a real socialist, like in terms of a communist, you're going to say the government should get involved all the time because the government works for the people and the corporations work for their shareholders to get rich. And so who are you going to trust? And a lot of people, especially in Europe, other countries, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, they say, no, we trust the government more than we trust these corporations. In the United States, we don't trust government so much. It's part of the reason why we don't like them to intervene. And the way it works in terms of economics is once you raise the taxes, what do you do with the taxes? Do you just give it back to the people in terms of money? You could. Do you invest it in schools? You could. Do you invest it in roads? You could. Do you invest it in prisons? You could. Do you invest it in parks or daycare, healthcare? Should the COVID shots be free? Should the government be paying for that? These are the kinds of questions that again, that comes up. How much should the government get involved in these things?
There's a lot of different ways that socialism and liberalism and conservatism can be expressed. You said it's not an either or kind of a situation, right? It's something that each of these exists in a spectrum, philosophically from one to the other. How does that end up in the real world then? Are countries, when they embrace socialism or fight against socialism, are they understanding it the same way? Are they just kind of doing their own thing, and then we as political scientists call it socialism later? How do we get this expressed in the real world?
It all depends on the political culture of the country you live in. And that's basically the determinant. But also, people who are raised in New York City may have a different perspective compared to people who are raised, let's say, on a ranch in Wyoming. And so even within a single country, there can be different kinds of political culture, and they color how you feel about these questions. So let's say that you're a European. Europeans trust their government. Americans don't trust their government. But if you think about it, the Europeans who came to the United States, they emigrated. It's because they were persecuted for religion, or they were considered criminals, whether they were or not. These were people who didn't like the government, so they left. So it's not a surprise that people in America, they're like, oh no, I'm not going to trust the government. But in Europe, the people who stayed there, a lot of them were satisfied. And so they do trust the government to protect them. And so they feel more comfortable with, let's say, having national health care, where everybody has health insurance automatically. They just feel a little bit better about it and more comfortable. And if they feel more comfortable with it, then that's going to color their views. Socialism was less important here because there were plenty of jobs, plenty of work to go around. In Europe, there weren't a lot of jobs to go around. The women needed to stay home, take care of their families, and the husbands needed a job to feed their families. Otherwise, there wouldn't be enough food. In the United States, we gave land away for people to till or ranch. There was just that much of it. So really different political philosophies or rather political cultures colored the political philosophy. And that helps you decide where you belong on the spectrum. Let's not forget that the Nazis were actually National Socialists. And since they're National Socialists, they had a lot of government involvement in the economy. I have to tell you, and they wanted to make sure that the Aryan race got a lot of goodies from the government. If you weren't Aryan, you didn't get those goodies, but there was still a socialist element right there.
Since you mentioned the Nazi connection with socialism, I imagine that that's not the same kind of socialism that we see in today's countries. Is it that difference of socialism for a select group as opposed to socialism maybe with more equity as a goal? Is that sort of where today's countries that tend to be socialist fall?
It really depends on the particular politics of the country. There are still people today, let's say in Hungary, where they do want the government to get involved in the economy, but only for Hungarians and true Hungarians. The True Finn Party, another extreme right party, they want lots of goodies, but only for their particular group of people. And then you've got other countries that are more multicultural, multinational, and they're more concerned about distributing making sure everyone has, let's say, healthcare, or everybody has an education. Because in the end, if you have immigrant children who don't get an education, they're gonna go to jail. They're not gonna be a useful member of society. So the idea is that it's good to invest in these people, because then it'll help society as a whole. And the thing to keep in mind is that these views change for people throughout time. Churchill once said, if you're 20 and not a socialist, you have no heart. And if you're 40 and not a conservative, you have no brain. And what he meant is that people, when they're younger, they're usually more to the left. And then as they get older, they're more to the right. If you look at different studies, though, in the United States, it seems to be not so much associated with age as associated with education. People who are more educated tend to be more to the left.
Does socialism make people happy?
Some socialism does. I think that's the key. I'm a very much a middle path person. You want to have some pride in your country and love of your country. Otherwise, your country's going to fall apart. You want to have some semblance of equality, like everyone gets a high school education. But you don't want the government telling everybody what to do all the time. You don't want government dictated equality. Otherwise, people can't bloom, and you don't have a meritocracy, and they can't do what they need to do. And you have to have space open for entrepreneurship. So you want to have some government regulation of businesses, just so people aren't cheating each other, but you don't want to stifle it either. So you want to be someplace in the middle. But it's true, if you look at some charts as to which are the happiest countries in the world, the top country in the world is Finland. Next is Denmark, Norway, Iceland, Netherlands, Switzerland, Sweden, then New Zealand, Canada, and Austria make up the top 10. These are all countries where they have socialized medicine. They have free schooling for everybody. Universities are basically free. And people feel that they have enough of a social welfare net that if something terrible goes wrong, like you get sick, you become an orphan, right? You lose your family in a car accident, that there'll be some sort of safety net to help you get through those hard times. And those countries tend to be the happiest. People are happier when there is more government involvement than not. And the United States is number 19. So still pretty happy. And we still have free roads. Does anyone want to pay tolls on I-80? I don't think so. But that means that we're going to a socialist understanding of I-80. We're going to pay taxes, and we're going to use those taxes to repair the roads, right? That's kind of the opposite. Do you have the individual pay, or do you have the group pay? Countries in the world that are the least happy are the ones with the least effective government and the least effective social services. So the unhappiest countries in the world are South Sudan, Central African Republic, Afghanistan, Tanzania, Rwanda, Yemen, Malawi, Syria, where there's a civil war, Botswana, and Haiti. And so you can see that the countries with the least effective government, where the government is least able to take care of its citizens, those are the ones that no one wants to live there.
There do seem to be some connections that you can make as far as the way that governments provide for their people and the happiness of those people within the country.
So in the end, the communist countries such as Cuba and North Korea, people there aren't happy because they're not free, right? And North Korea is maybe the worst example because they don't even feed their people. They had these giant billboards that would say, eat 2 meals a day for your country. And their view was, if you love your country, you won't eat a lot because there's not enough food for everyone. You really want to find something in the middle. And where that middle area is, well, you can tell that the countries that are the happiest are all pretty similar. They're definitely not communist countries. They're called social welfare countries. And that's a very specific name. And it just means that they have a lot of social services for their people. And these are countries that are strong allies of the United States. They have a strong affinity for the US. We have a lot of foreign direct investment into each of them. So there's definitely a free economy and capitalism. There's just quite a bit of regulation, but regulation that's so effective that other companies keep investing in them, right? Google invests in Finland, they invest in Germany. I mean, Germany, maybe you've heard, has a lot of regulation. They also have a booming economy. It sure doesn't stop companies from wanting to invest there. In fact, people say that the fact that they have such a good regulatory system encourages foreign direct investment because they know it's predictable and that they can depend on government services and that everything will be stable. It's creating stability. But in the end, it's really up to the political culture of the country.
You often hear, oh, well, look at how well Denmark is doing, and then you have the counterpoint, look at Venezuela. Is it fair to say that it's not even necessarily a comparison, that socialism as it is in the United States is different than either of those countries?
You can't compare them because people throw around the word socialism, all the time, and they're usually using it wrong. It's just, how much do you want your government to get involved? Let's take I-80, right? What if we just had people who drove an I-80 pay for I-80? Well, people of Wyoming would be paying a lot more than people in Maine. If you see the interstate system as part of the national security of the United States, because you need to be able to get from point A to point B, and the people in Maine benefit from I-80 existing because it can get stuff from one part of the country to another, then Maine should help pay for I-80. And you have to decide what's more important, your pocketbook in that moment or the security of your country. And that kind of depends on how much you trust your government and love your country.
When my students hear the word socialism in class, what should they think?
The first thing they should figure out is the context. Are they talking about a communist country or a communist political party? Or if they're talking about Europe, they're talking probably about a center-left party. Are we talking about the Cold War communism, which is really totalitarianism? Or are we talking about a center-left party, say in Europe or in one of America's allies like Australia or New Zealand? And we should really be aware of the emotional baggage attached to the word socialism. When people hear it, they often go, that's a scary word. And when you think about the legacy of communism, you can understand why. But very often it'll just be a question about whether the government should get more involved in regulating the economy, schooling, and industry, and whether that would be more efficient than letting it just the free market decide.
All right, so how would you sum this up for a student?
Well, I'd like to go over some terminology because they really can get tricky. I'd like to go over first the term public goods. So public goods are a commodity or service that's provided without profit to all members of society, either by a government, or it could be a private individual, or it could be like Bill Gates, or it could be an organization like a church. But public goods are education, clean water, roads, public parks, police. Those are all things that would be public goods. A social welfare state is the concept of a government in which the state or a well-established network of social institutions, again, like churches, religious institutions, play a key role in the protection and promotion of the economic and social well-being of its citizens. And churches have traditionally done a lot of work this way, making sure that churches run soup kitchens, right, or homeless shelters, but governments do that too. They try to come up with some sort of safety net to help people when they get into dire straits. Social democracies, yet another term, is the political, social, and economic philosophy which in socialism that supports political and economic democracy and free markets. So it's really, I would say, the dominant form in Europe, like in Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, the Netherlands, that is the happiest countries in the world. They definitely have free markets and free speech and all those freedoms, but they really think about society as a whole and how to make sure that all of society benefits from everything. And then there are center-left parties. These are socialist parties of France or Spain. These are really boring, middle-of-the-road socialist parties that are great allies of the United States. The Labour parties of Ireland and the UK, the Social Democratic parties of Germany and Sweden. These are usually one of the two largest political parties in Europe. They often win elections, and they're pretty boring, to be honest. Then if we talk about terminology of the left, we'll talk about socialism as a political and economic theory of social organization. So it's different, which means that the government should get involved and control the means of production. It should control factories. It should control stores. Everything should be regulated by the community or the people as a whole. And then in Marxist theory, and this is why socialism gets so scary, it's this transitional social state between the overthrow of capitalism and the realization of communism. Now, democratic socialists are socialists, but they also want a democracy. So they're very far to the left, but they also believe that the people should decide everything. And if the people decide in a democracy that they don't want socialism, they don't win power, that's okay. They think democracy is really important, but they want to make sure there's a lot of social welfare for people. Communists say that's not enough, that you need to come up with a system where the government has power, a lot of power, to make sure that factories are nationalized. That means like General Motors would be owned by the people, Google would be owned by the people, Amazon would be owned by the people, and the profits would go to the people, and the people would then, and then the government would distribute everything to everybody. So Jeff Bezos of Amazon, who is over $100 billion, he would just have enough money to get what he needs, and the 100 billion would be distributed equally among everybody, because after all, who shops at Amazon? The people do. And then there are the scariest of all. Those are the revolutionary communist Marxist Leninists. They think communism's right, but they don't think Jeff Bezos is just going to hand over his money. They say that you need a violent revolution where people will be hurt and killed. It's the only way to get the money from the rich people and redistribute it to the poor. And so that's kind of socialism is really different from the middle of the road socialism you see in Europe. Very different meanings. So let's talk about the German Democratic Republic. That was East Germany, and it was a communist country under Soviet domination. But how would you know, unless you know that the German Democratic Republic is actually a totalitarian state, right? On the other hand, the Socialist Party of France is a totally boring center-left party, which has long been an ally of the United States and supports free markets and free democracy. And the thing that maybe makes things even more confusing is the conservative parties of Europe all support the idea of a national health care, paid maternity leave, and subsidized or free college education, which goes against most American conservative philosophy. So Boris Johnson, for example, who's definitely extreme right, conservative party, supports Brexit. He is a big advocate of the national health system, the NHS, and wants to put more government money into it. So it just goes to show you that one person's idea of what socialism is another person's idea of what conservatism is. So when a student hears the word socialism in class, the first thing I want them to do is to think about what is the context, because the word social and socialist and even the word democratic can have completely different meanings.